Welcome everybody. In this video, we're going to be running through getting SharePoint metadata right as per the title. So many questions we get about this and so many different viewpoints from leadership through to IT. Ben and I spent a lot of time working out how can we sort of codify this and bring this to life. So Ben, thank you for joining me today. Maybe you could just start by giving me one line of what metadata is, just so we'll make sure we're in the right place.
Yeah, no problem. So metadata is effectively information that describes information. So if we think about SharePoint, it might be a document that has some columns on it that might mean things like the document type, which we can use to filter and find things. It might mean the status, where it is in a process, or it could mean something like it's effective or next review date.
Okay. And then I think the other big thing to say is a lot of people come into this thinking we don't need metadata anymore because we've got AI. Well, actually, as we'll explore later, the opposite is true. AI benefits from good metadata. I'm going to show some examples of that as well. So just in case you think that's the answer, I'm afraid it's not that simple. So when I'm speaking to people, it's typically, the leadership teams, senior people in organization, they're thinking, actually, metadata is this golden panacea, which is going to fix the chaos. And this is normally driven by, I can't find stuff, or I'm not confident in what I do find is accurate, is current. And only if we have metadata, we could solve this. And, to a degree, they're right. It will bring order to information. And as I touched on earlier, it will help AI work properly because Copilot does benefit from metadata. But also it's going to improve governance as well. So we're considering about, well, how, as Ben touched on earlier, well, how can I track who signed this? When did they sign it? What version is this? All these kind of governance points, that's all metadata. So you bring that together, you're reducing risk. But then we've got the other side of the story, Ben, which is the IT side.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is fundamentally different. So IT are thinking about we want to bring things under control again. It's going to solve some of that information chaos. We start thinking about how we might want to force users to make their information findable by tagging things. And it's going to help us identify information that we can archive or delete because we're worried about how much storage we're taking up within SharePoint.
Yeah, it's a very real thing these days. And I think a lot of people, when they first turn on SharePoint, get excited coming from a file server environment into SharePoint. Great, we can get metadata, we can force lots of people to do things. But there's a question which comes from the users who are caught in the middle between leadership and IT is like, well, why am I doing this?
Yeah, exactly. Or to be honest, even further, what is it? What is metadata? A lot of people don't necessarily understand. So if they don't understand it and they don't know why they're doing it, that is quite challenging. And of course, we can start looking at some of the problems that they might have if we move on to the next slide there. So yeah, the key problem that we have with any kind of system is the resistance that the users, who are the ones who actually have to go and do this, they're not going to go and do it. It might be that they're not clear on what the business outcome is. Why do they need to do this? Is a productivity drag. Have I seriously got to fill in 5 pieces of metadata before I can even upload a document, for example? What about when I start applying that at scale? What if I've got to bring in a whole load of documents that I might have downloaded from a pack somewhere and I've got to go and tag all of those documents up? That's really painful. And then let's say that certain teams might have started to embrace the idea of using metadata within SharePoint. But when that information flows from one site to another, because it does happen, everyone's using it inconsistently. Everyone's got different named columns. They're using different values. It's not consistent, and therefore it starts to lose value again.
Yeah, and I think this point at the bottom of the slide really, carries the weight, which is like, it's bureaucracy, it's overhead, it's slowing me down. Why do they make us do this? And you've got to go back to the value. And not too often we see people configuring metadata, making it for us, and then people go back to sharing things other ways. They send it through email, they use their OneDrive, and then they're using the wrong tools for the job that you set out for them. It's an interesting one that I hear this a lot, and you tell me that you've come out of a workshop and the requirement is we need a file naming convention. We need SharePoint to name our files, correctly so it follows our standard.
Yeah, exactly. I hear this all the time. And, I often push back and say, no, you don't need a file naming convention. If you're using SharePoint, then you don't really. What you're coming from is a file server mindset. And actually, for those people that they understand the concept that they need to apply some kind of structure for to the information, but they're using the wrong solution to do it. So effectively, file naming is just metadata in disguise at the end of the day. So they kind of get that they need to do something to structure it, but they're not aware of the right tools of what SharePoint can do. And the problem with these file naming conventions is they're never followed consistently. They can result in things like, underscore final, but then someone goes and marks something and updates it, and you get underscore final, updated comments, etc. Right? So it's not applied it's confusing. It's very inconsistent because you can't enforce it in any way, and you certainly can't easily automate it in SharePoint. And it doesn't really add any value. It's not helping me find my information more easily. Because of these problems, I'm not able to go and ensure that I've actually got the right version of the document. So I'm not a big fan of trying to enforce standard file naming conventions, but we think there's a better way here.
Yeah, and I think the screenshot I got here, well, this is actually an output from our payroll system. And so, yes, the system can be, consistent, but I still can't act on it. I still can't get a list of all my files and say, give me October's payroll, because I haven't got the ability to filter on that data. So you might solve some of the problems, but you're not going to solve all of them. So what can metadata achieve? And if we go rather from sort of, the technical application and go up a level to say, well, actually, what problems can we solve, with metadata?
Yeah, exactly. I think it comes back to this purpose. Why are we doing it? What's the benefit? So in our view, we've identified 4 key roles that metadata can play. So the first and probably the most prevalent is retrieval findability. I hear this all the time. I can't find stuff. Metadata will make that easier. It's going to help people find that content across their structures without digging through folders and having to enhance AI search here.
So, Ben, interestingly, on this retrieval and findability, enhancing AI search.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what we're saying here is that actually now with the advances in Copilot, Copilot is able to tap into the metadata, and that's something that we're going to show you a little bit later on.
Okay.
So the next example, the next use case is around accountability and evidence. So tracking review dates, being able to see who approved a document, who is responsible for document, how we manage the life cycle, things like policy management systems, how we might track when something was signed off, the kind of information or metadata that an auditor is going to want to look at, perhaps during an ISO audit process.
Okay. Business process.
Yeah, so the third is around business process. So this is where we're using metadata or flagging up metadata and how it relates to a process such as, contract drafting, maybe checking references, going through certain set of stage gates around a new onboarding process for a HR employee or a new contract, for example.
Yeah, I think HR is a great example because you've got maybe a common set of documents like your employee contract and maybe your right to work. And then you're going to go through that process. And if you've got, managing multiple of those at the same time, being able to filter on that quickly, I can see, a lot of value in that. And you might want to say, well, if I know what the start date is and I haven't got references 2 weeks out, that's a good point where I need to escalate that. And then, yeah,
Exactly.
information and governance is probably not the one that people jump to when they think of metadata then.
No, they're not, but it is still another primary use case. So with this, what we're really worried about is ensuring that we're keeping the information that's really important to us for as long as we're legally obliged to do so. And probably as importantly, we're disposing of it after we're obliged, so it's not creating a liability for us.
Yeah, I know. Is that maybe that classic rule that when you're taking CVs for a job application, you might want to make sure that after 6 months you delete them because you don't want to hold on to that personal data of unsuccessful candidates. And so I think the key takeaway is when you're thinking about your problem, how does it map to one of these roles? And as you said earlier, Ben, a lot of it is about findability. But as you said, other use cases do exist. If you're collecting metadata and it's not ticking one of these boxes, the chances are you probably don't need to. And I know when you go into workshops and people say, well, Ben, we want to capture this, or we want to capture that, you have almost like, a test which you put against that to say, well, look, why are we doing this?
Yeah, exactly. So it's just thinking of some basics of simplistic things. What outcome is it driving? If it's not matching one of those scenarios, you probably don't need it. The second is who is actually going to use it? Who relies on it? If no one actively relies on it, if no one is going to use it according to those use cases, then again, it's over time, it's just going to decay because people won't continue to actively fill it in or ensure it's populated appropriately. The third is, can it be defaulted or automated? This is probably the most significant part, actually, because one of the biggest barriers, as we said before, is the reliance on users to populate all of this metadata when it's an overhead and they don't see why. So anything that can be defaulted or automated or simplified is going to really, really help, because manual tagging is not going to apply at scale. And then the fourth one, which is quite an interesting point here, which is that what happens if it's wrong or it's blank? If nothing happens, it's probably not that important. If something breaks, then it probably will need some more structural attention. And I think this test basically enforces a level of discipline over whether something is needed or whether something will need to be populated in a consistent way over time. And I think this key statement that we've got really is that metadata needs to follow the desired outcome as opposed to precede it and let the outcomes come from it, if that makes sense.
Excellent. And look, it's probably worth saying at this point, if you're watching this, you can go to our website where we've got the deck, and that will be available shortly after this publication. We also publish this on YouTube with all our other videos. So if you're finding this interesting, want to get a bit more detail, or want to get the handout to circulate internally, feel free to do that. So moving on. Now, this slide, Ben, is a slide I've seen before, and it's one we've used on our SharePoint architecture webinar. So that went down really well. A lot of people got some clarity about how to structure their information. But how does that align to our metadata story?
Yeah, I think it aligns perfectly, actually. So when we look at that, we can see we've kind of mapped out some, this is not an exhaustive list, by the way, but just to highlight how it will map between different use cases. So when we take retrieval and findability, yeah, we're thinking policies, making them easy to find, knowledge content, how are we going to narrow down from maybe thousands of, documents and use cases of various different things. When we're looking at accountability, again, policies comes into mind here, how we're going to audit that they've been signed off appropriately. Contracts, who was in the contract review process, who signed it off, who authorized it. When it comes to business process, again, things like contracts come back into play. Where does a contract sit as part of a sales onboarding process? Same thing with employee records. Where is the employee in the onboarding journey, and where that applies in the process? And then finally, information governance. Again, anything that we have an obligation to keep, such as records, financial statements, anything that we need to ensure that we retain it for a period of time, and then potentially dispose of it. That's where we're thinking in the information governance scenario.
And I think it was interesting for me when I looked at this, Ben, that a certain type of data can sit across more than one purpose. And
Exactly.
maybe they have separate, fields. Maybe they share common fields to achieve that goal. I think the other one just worth bringing up is we talked in a previous video about the standardization of how we would look at collaboration using SharePoint, and you talked about these classic 4 libraries. Now, do you want to talk a bit about how that then maps into the metadata story?
Yeah, so I think this really aligns back to, as we said, the previous video, is that when we think about collaboration in particular, metadata is less important unless it aligns to one of those scenarios that we've said before. Okay, so findability is less relevant because we're in the moment with collaboration. Someone might have sent me a link to something, or I'm day to day, I'm looking at a tracker sheet or something along those lines. I know where it is, so I don't need someone to help me find it. I know how to get there because I'm in and out of it all the time. But when it becomes more important is things like sales records, maybe reference information, reports, where I want to find things. track them through a process, for example, map a business process, or ensure that they're accountable when they need to be much more structured. So it comes into play in those other libraries that we talked about before.
Perfect. It's a good answer. Okay, look, we've done some talking. I think it'd be really good if we can bring this to life, Ben, and we just talk, and show what these look like when they come to life.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's fire up the demo. Okay.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is just go through an example of each one of those use cases and what it means and how we can benefit from it. So the first is going to be the retrieval and findability. So what we're going to do within our sales records library, we're going to do a search for all of our MSAs, effectively our terms and conditions. Okay, so let's just search for MSA. So something to note, SharePoint is a very powerful, has a very powerful search engine, which is going to read inside all of the body of content. And sometimes it can be too powerful because it's going to return everything. So we've returned all of these various different documents. And now what we can do is filter them by their client status, for example. So let's click on the client status and filter by the active MSAs.
So what's interesting here, Ben, is everything here this is all our metadata. So this is all the information that sits outside the document effectively, but is giving us that value. So we can filter there.
So we've done a search and then we've narrowed down our results to make them more relevant. And we could further refine it based on things like, whether it's signed or et cetera, if that's appropriate. So that's the first quite simple example. Search for something, use the metadata to refine it, narrow down, and get down to what it is that I need to do. The next example we're going to talk about is accountability. So in this case, we're thinking approval process, approved by dates, etc. So Rupert, if you just scroll over to the right-hand side a minute. So we can see within here, we have our approval status column. In fact, one of those documents is already approved, and we could even filter in that regard if we wanted to. So what we have done is we've just applied the out-of-the-box document library approvals to this. And there are slightly more, it's quite a simplistic approach, but there are more things that we can do with this. But just to demonstrate this, so let's take the next one in the list, and we're going to submit that for approval. We'll stick with the defaults, and we're going to self-approve it, which isn't realistic in a live scenario, but just to illustrate the point. So it's going to kick off our approval process. Shouldn't take too long.
And so what I like about this, Ben, is that that data sits against the file. So I can have a view of all those files, and I can look at what's been approved, what's been requested, what's not been submitted. So I've got that high-level view. So as you say, I can now, well, it's come from me, it's coming to me. So I can click approve here.
Yep. Good stuff. We'll just give that a second. Right, perfect. So let's just click into that that result there. So now what we can see is it's got a status of approved. It was approved by Ben L. It was approved on that particular date and time. So this information, again, is metadata about the document. Now, in a realistic scenario, we want to be able to draw that information out and promote it into the columns in SharePoint more realistically through our own, or you may create your own Power Automate approval process so that you can then action and report on that data a little bit more easily. But it hopefully illustrates the point when we talk about a metadata related to accountability.
Okay, so yeah, that approval date could be really useful, but maybe all the bits of information which got us there, maybe not so, at least at this level. Okay.
Exactly. So let's just sort of refresh the library a minute, because as we move on to the next scenario here. So let's just go to sales records again. So what we can see in this scenario is that we have all of our sales records are organized within a concept called document sets, and they are grouped by their client status. So that client status is an example of following a very simple business process. First of all, they're an opportunity, then they might become active, or we might lose, or perhaps they might leave in time, for example. So that's a really simple business process represented by a status column and represented by the owner who's responsible for it. So if we wanted to, for example, take one of those, maybe Helix Biosystems, for instance, the second one, and make that active, we can drag and drop that from one status to another, and we can then see that the client status has changed and it's been regrouped. And what's really nice about this is that all of the documents that are within it, because we're using a document set, will inherit that same status.
Okay, and I believe we don't need to worry about the folders, but the documents within these folders will also have that same status, Ben.
Exactly. So if you could just go back to the root of the sales records library a minute, do you mind flipping over to the recent statements of work view, which is behind the chevrons there? Okay, so in this view, so what we're looking at here is we can see we've got some columns such as effective date. If you scroll over a minute, we've also got the review date, okay, or the renewal date. So again, an example of a business process that we can start to tie into this is where we could trigger a notification to the account owner when a renewal date is due for renewal, so that the account owner can contact the client and ensure, and hopefully they're going to renew the contract. So let's just quickly demonstrate how we can set that up. If you click on the three dots just above, we're going to go to Integrate, Flows, and we're going to set a reminder against the renewal date. Okay.
4 layers down of navigation, but we got
Indeed. So we're just going to kick off one of these or set up. Now we can see here that it's going to remind me X number of days in advance, which you can promote. We can create that. And now that's going to go and send us a notification 30 days before the renewal date of each of those documents. You can configure that workflow and do what you want with it if you're that way inclined. It's something that is available for you to update, but you can see where we're going. This is how the metadata is driving or supporting our business process for a renewal. Now, the final example around information governance, we're going to flip over to our HR employee records area here. And if you could click on the current employment contracts and just scroll over, please, if that's okay. We can see that we've got some documents that are marked as having a HR records retention label applied. So this is a slightly different type of metadata. It's something called effectively a retention label that is created within Microsoft Purview to ensure that we can protect and retain this document and meet our legal obligations. So let's go and apply a label to one of those new documents. Just have a scroll down. We've got a few columns in here. It's a bit messy, but we'll scroll down. So what we can see there is that we have HR records retained for 7 years. If we mark this document in that way, which is a form of applying metadata, we are now going to tie this into our governance process to ensure it's kept for 7 years and potentially disposed after that point.
And Ben, obviously I've done that manually. There's probably a use case where we want to do that automatically, so we're not relying on the end user. Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, within Power Automate, it's possible to do this, but there are also auto application rules that you can configure within Microsoft Purview as well.
Okay, and it might be, when the finish date is set after 3 years, I'm happy to delete all that content. Can we put a rule around that too?
Yeah, well, absolutely, because if anything, that is actually a more realistic use case, particularly in employee records, that you want to keep them until an event happens, i.e. they leave, and then retain them for a period of time after that. So again, we could potentially pull out the end date of the employee. We could tap into some form of workflow, Power Automate process that goes and triggers that. Or probably more scalably, I would say, is we can use event-based retention within Microsoft Purview. So effectively, when that employment leaves, trigger a process, the documents will be kept for 3 years and then automatically disposed.
That sounds great. Okay, I think you've got one more for you up your sleeve, Ben.
Well, exactly. So I think, those are our core examples, but let's start to see how we can benefit from AI. So Rupert, do you mind just refreshing the employee records library? So now that we have Copilot enabled within this document library here, and we have some metadata on it, we can enhance our Copilot experience with the metadata. So we're going to do a query to, if you just go and paste that in. So we're just going to do a query. We want to grab the salaries from within the documents in this library and filter them by all of the employees that are marked as actively employed.
Okay. So I know I've got these 4 blue ones which are actively employed, so I'm hoping I'm going to get 4 responses.
Let's hope.
Oh, and I have.
Good stuff. And there's the right one. So we've got Amelia, Chloe, Rupert, and Ben. It's pulled out their salaries. It's applied the filtering. So you can see in the notes, employees marked as onboarding, pre-employment are not included. It's only pulling out the ones that are currently employed. I think the really interesting thing there, if you look at Chloe, what it's actually been able to do is recognize, so within the library, there is the original contract, but it's actually picked up on the fact that there's a sales increase letter, a salary increase letter, and it's been able to pull out and recognize that this new salary kicked in after a certain period. So that's really demonstrating the power of AI to tap into that, but using the filtering of the metadata to focus the results.
And I think what's really interesting for me is that it talks about employees who are currently employed. We don't have that information anywhere else besides in that metadata column. So it's not pulled it from a document. It's pulled it from the metadata and worked out without me having to write some, natural language or employment status equals. It's just taken my natural language and said, okay, I think this is what you mean. Here's the answer, and it's come out spot on.
Exactly.
So I think really seeing some interesting value from Copilot, and that's a relatively new enhancement. I think late last year. So hopefully, that's really going to start turning the dial on, does Copilot add value?
Yeah, completely.
Right, Ben. Let's just go back to the data because we've gone through the key uses there. So let's think about application. And when I mean application is how do we apply this? If we found our purpose, we know what the business justification is for doing this, what's the right way to go about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're really trying to do is reduce the overhead on the end user to be able to do this. So the first way that I try and encourage people is to think about what document templates you have. If you are producing documents within your organization, there is a good chance that they may be coming from a template. So if you have templates for onboarding letters, templates for design documents, statements of work, certainly if they're Office documents, you can embed the metadata within the template, something such as a document type, and then you don't have to rely on the user to tag it with that type. They simply use the right template and that will carry through into their document library. So we've got a little screenshot of using the organizational asset library in that particular case. The next example is using column default values. So good example of this, let's imagine that we have a SharePoint site dedicated to a particular project. That project might have a project code, and we have defaulted the project code metadata column to that value based on that project. So any documents that go inside it will be automatically tagged in that way. So when I'm trying to scan across documents across all of my projects that I might be working in a search experience, I can filter down or use that AI experience again to say filter down based on this project code.
So that's an interesting one from Copilot, isn't it? You think about it, you say to Copilot, project code X, it's going to pull the right set of documents. I think the other thing is when you talked about projects, typically when we're delivering project solutions, we create a template site for that project, and then we go through a workflow process, which basically builds that site for end users. But as part of that process, we can predetermine that project code. And so you don't actually have to do anything as an end user. It just happens.
Yeah, it's automatically set up as part of the site creation process.
Perfect. Okay, document sets, Ben.
Yeah, so we've already seen a quick example of document sets. I'm just mindful that the AI background is filtering me out. We've already seen a quick example of document sets with our sales records and actually within our employee records as well. So the key thing about those is that we can create our document set to contain all of our documents. And yes, we've got to tag that. But once we've tagged it, all of the documents that go inside it will be tagged in the same way. So if you think of that example we just showed, where we can say, show me all of the contracts for the employed members of staff, it was able to pick up on the fact that the contracts lived in that document set and inherited the employment status without having to tag it individually.
And you'll notice on the slide I've got 1, 2, and 3. So these first things are the first things that you want to be doing. If that's not going to work for you, Ben, we've got the next option, which is our good friend AI.
So I think this is more recently become really, really viable. Microsoft have made some massive improvements and enhancements to this with the introduction of autofill columns. So effectively, an autofill column allows you to write an AI-based prompt that is going to read inside the document and extract information and promote it into your metadata to support those use cases we showed before. So an example of this is extract the renewal date from the contract. And in fact, we can even see here is calculated by amending the renewal term to the start using this format. So very clever in terms of how it's able to get the information out, create that new renewal date to then tie into our business process.
And actually,
Other
what a lot of
example,
people,
oh, go on.
I was going to say, a lot of people might not realize, but when we were going through that example there, the project values, they could have come from that document, the start date, the renewal date, all those kind of key information where you might say, I'll get the user to type it in. Actually, we can do more stuff before we even get to asking a user to do anything.
Yeah, and one of the scenarios I really like about this actually is the ability to pick up the actual signed statements of work or signed documents, particularly when we're using a third-party e-signature tool, for example, being able to tap into the fact that within that document, it has a signature block that has been filled in, and then say, based on that, mark this as whether or not it's signed or not, because those are the ones that I need to be filtering down on for my compliance purposes, for example.
Okay. Now, if step 1 doesn't work and step 2 doesn't work, finally we get to the end user.
Yeah, if all else fails, if there is no other option, then what do we ask the end user to tag? But hopefully we have minimized the impact on them, and hopefully we've explained to them what use case this is going to serve and what interest this is going to have for them. So yeah, when all else fails, then it comes down to end user, but hopefully we've really minimized that impact on them.
And we're going to try and make it easy. We're going to use things like drill down or taxonomies, so people are tagging consistently. Let's think about that case. So that works in a particular use case, for maybe a library bend. But when we're thinking about rolling this out across the organization or across my SharePoint tenant, what are the considerations there?
Yeah, so I think the key thing around this is when you're trying to roll this out across your whole organization, you're trying to think about what the lowest common denominator is to get everyone working in the same way. So with that, we can't really address all 4 of those use cases realistically. But the one use case that we can start to try and address is the first one, which is retrieval and findability. So when we look at rolling this out, we would be promoting a standard set of columns that appears on every single document library. So document type, keywords, the source site, and we'll just kind of explain what we mean in all of these cases, right? So document type, as we talked about, where it's pulling from the template. Keywords, just adding an additional capability to allow people to further filter and get what they need to do. You can see Rupert's already introduced the concept, but the idea of tapping into the tenant-wide taxonomy, where instead of having every site have its own set of keywords, have a central set of keywords that can be reused so it's all used in a consistent way. Because the reality is information does flow from one site to another. People share documents to each other. Sometimes things do need to move or be copied. There are valid reasons why that happens. So if we have every single document and library having its own set of metadata, when we move it, that gets lost unless we have a standard. Now, this
And
introduction of the, sorry, go on, Rupert, yeah.
yeah, actually, there's an interesting use case here in terms of knowledge management. So imagine you have a number of projects, you're generating artifacts that you want to keep. when you promote those maybe to a separate knowledge site, you want to know where it came from, the source site or the source project. You want it tagged in the same way as all the other knowledge from all the other projects. So we're using that same taxonomy, those same terms. So I think, yeah, there's some real interest here. Sorry, Ben, back to you, sir.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think you've just kind of hit the nail on the head there, really. Exactly. Information does move from one place to another. It comes out of a project and goes into a knowledge repository. So this other point about having a default column that says what is the source site that is the originator of this document. So when it moves from one site to another, people have some, it's not like traceability, but it just helps understand where did that document come from without having any overhead on the end user.
And really, these are driving that first initial use case, which is that retrieval findability, right? And that's often where you're seeing Copilot operating at scale and SharePoint search operating at scale.
Yeah, exactly. And you can tie that into your standard training that you give everyone when you're trying to roll this out for the whole organization. Now, as I said, I think what we don't do is try and enforce things like standard accountability, standard document sign-off process, because the reality is that teams do work differently. If you enforce that on everyone, that is a massive user adoption change that is really only going to address a small subset of use cases. So this is when we need to start looking at applying those 3 additional use cases more likely on a site-by-site basis.
Okay, well, that beautifully segues me into the next slide, which is like, we've talked about the organizational stuff. Now let's thinking about the library and the document/document set.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got the base layer that you roll out to all of your sites. You get everyone trained, everyone working in exactly the same way, and then you can start talking to your individual departments to look at how you can support their accountability needs, data governance needs, or how you can support streamlining their business process by bringing in some of these additional columns and metadata types that we've talked about before, whether that's at the library level or going further into the individual document set or document level.
So it's interesting, when you look at a document at the end of it, it will have some organizational metadata attached to it. It might have some metadata attached to that library, maybe the project name or the client. It may then be part of a deal stage. And finally, it might have a review date or an expiry date, and you're building that up through the process. But the great thing is for the person who's doing that, say, contract, is most of that will be pre-populated. They don't got to worry about it.
Exactly.
Okay, Ben. So look, we've run through a lot. I think there's a few key takeaways and some principles to take away, which I think I'll just run through based on what I've heard today. So we're always thinking, let's start with the outcome. What are we trying to solve here rather than apply metadata? A lot of people start from a technical first approach. Actually, we're starting from the end. And we've got the four scenarios there, which we touched on. Then consider, well, given that, what is the base layer? What do we want to apply across everything, but at the lightest possible way? We talked about the 3 keys that we tend to use with our clients. Moving on from that, now we need to think about, well, how are we going to populate this information? Ideally, there's defaults in there, so the user doesn't need to do anything. And with a default, it's going to be 100% right. A level below that, we've got AI. Now, there is a slight cost to AI. It doesn't fall under the Copilot license. That may change. And AI is probably 95, 98% accurate. So, there is a little bit there too. And only then, when we've exhausted those approaches, do we actually ask the end user to do something. We go to that manual approach. And then you need to take the people along with you, take users along with you, explain the why are we doing this, how this works, how they can get the best out of it, and what value they can get from actually applying metadata. People are a lot more open to doing these things when they can see the value coming out of it. And as we say at the bottom here, metadata should follow the outcome, not precede it. So Ben, this is a great framework. I think people should print this out, stick this on their walls. It will certainly drive, I think, the right thinking, make it your wallpaper. So I know we do this, but where do we do this, Ben?
Yeah, so the reality is this is something that we do everywhere. So whether it's a new organization that is starting from fresh and wants to get started in SharePoint and how to benefit from it in the right way, it could be an organization that is still heavily reliant on file shares and wants to start benefiting from working collaboratively online. We also see a lot of people, probably more and more now, where there's a lot of organizations that have let SharePoint grow organically without some of these standards or any kind of consistency, and they want to bring that under control. And then finally, when we start looking at kind of rollouts at scale, where we're not necessarily able to define every single site in advance and define all of the working structures, but instead we need to provide a framework that the organizations can bring on over time, again, it falls into play there as well.
And essentially, this is what we do as a business. We help organizations like you structure your information in SharePoint, make sure that you can apply the governance to that, and ultimately get value from that information. I think there's a few questions that you can ask yourself today coming out of this session. Firstly, where are you applying it right now, and is it doing the right job? It might be that you're asking for it, you're not even using it, and just causing frustration. And this might also apply to your SharePoint lists and forms, for example. Second thing is look at your standards. Have you established a baseline across your tenant or your environment of what's the key information that you want to keep and how can we make that simple? And then finally, it's that question about business process or accountability. Are we collecting information because we need to, or is there some other reason? And maybe there's a misalignment there and we're asking people to do stuff and it's not driving an outcome. So Ben, thank you for your help today. Really useful insight picking up from the work we do for our clients. If you found this interesting and liked a conversation, happy to have that conversation with you. Let's explore a bit about how you're using information right now. Maybe some things that you'd like to do but you're not doing. Maybe it's concerns about AI. We're hearing a lot of that. Do jump on our website, informationexp.com, and if you click on book a discovery call, it will drop straight into my diary and we can have that conversation. So thank you for your time today, and Ben, thank you.
Yep, see you next time.